Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I've got another 6 albums I want to suggest to you guys for some of the best music I've listened to so far in 2024. These are all going to go up against those tier 1 entries. We're going to look for the best albums and come up with a really good solid top 20 of new music for you guys by the end of this year. But for now, let's go and get started with the Guess Who, Pleine. Pleine is of interest for lots of reasons. First of all, yes, this is the band, the Guess Who, that made the song American Woman, but not really. Because in truth, the only member that's really from that original lineup is the drummer Gary Peterson, who bought the band's name under kind of sketchy circumstances somewhere in the mid-'80s. The rest of the group consists of a set of really highly talented musicians with really long resumes as sidemen, but a bunch of people you've never heard of before, like this guys have played with Slash, Ozzy Osbourne, and Jeff Haley. The ability level and the talent of the group is really impressive, and really provides these musicians, I think, with a gratifying creative outlet. Now, this scenario, I think, is really of interest to me because I have this personal interest in band identity and how, members can come in and out of a band and it still has some sort of, identity that persists over lineup changes. And this is my interest in Yes, has kind of always fueled this. And as a person who has zero investment in the Guess Who as a band, I can really come to this group without any kind of preconceived notions. It doesn't matter to me what the Guess Who has done before. I can accept this album on its own terms. But I also think it's very interesting, the very complicated thread that ties this group back to the original lineup of the group. Now, it's interesting this whole backstory is, either because of or in spite of the Guess Who's name, Pleine is actually a really fantastic recording. It does not sound like, your idea of American Woman, that kind of classic rock. If anything, it's almost like algorithm rock for Jellyfish. Their songs are very similarly ornate and meticulously put together like Jellyfish was, classic like Spilt Milk era Jellyfish. Many Jellyfish fans have been talking about this album, and I think for good reason. If you've been waiting for Jellyfish to put out a new album, knowing of course that's probably never going to happen, this is not a bad placebo. Next up I got J. Robbins, Basilisk. Basilisk exhibits a really raw immediacy that I found immediately appealing, and it reminded me a lot of the great alternative pop and power pop bands that were coming out of the Dallas scene in the mid-'90s. A lot of these groups are bands like The Reach and Chomsky, whose recordings are hard to find now, even if they can even still exist. J. Robbins is a guy who's a collaborator. He's most commonly associated with the band Jawbox, but he was sort of refining some songs and like trying to find ways to collaborate with some new ideas with a band that he put together. But as he went through it, and it just seemed like these songs kind of stood on their own. So rather than, go in and pick them apart in a studio setting, he did it the old school way. The band rehearsed the songs and they had them tight, had them together, then went to the studio and just recorded it. Just like you used to have to back whenever it cost money to go into the studio. And what this really captures, I think, on this album is a really super noticeable vitality that infuses these songs. All of these were mostly first takes with very little editing afterwards. Just played the songs down and played them clean, and that's got a real drive, puts a real drive on this album, I think, that relates to the live feeling that I got from many of those recordings from great 90s bands in the Dallas area. Great bass sounds in this album, as a matter of fact. I think that a lot of the tone quality and a lot of the timbres of this album are kind of spooling out from such a huge bass sound that is coming out of the low end of this album. But also, all of this would not mean a thing if it didn't have great songwriting. And the songs in this album are super memorable. The harmonies are super catchy. It's got these descending bass lines that are clashy, where he's not always playing the root. I love that. And the songs are varied, but all still very accessible. Again, this is a guy that I would go out to see live, because I feel pretty sure that these songs sound exactly like they do on the recording here. Next up, I got Brittany Howard's Now What.
I wonder if I'm just so I'm not alone. It's painful, but I might as well say sorry. I surrender, let me go. I don't have love to give you more. You're filling up my energy. I told the truth, so set me free. If you want someone to hate, then blame it on me. Blame it on me.
Now, the Alabama Shakes lead singer, Brittany Howard, released her first solo album in 2020, Jamie. And of course, that was a tough year. And there's lots of songs on that album, I think, that really spoke to me and were songs that my family especially really kind of bonded over. The album itself on the whole was an album, I think, of a lot of risks and really tried to challenge the idea of genre. She calls herself a musician who's genre fluid. I think you really saw that on Jamie. Now, if you look at Now What in comparison, those kinds of risk-taking genre challenging ideas that she had for Jamie aren't quite as obvious. Really, it's a little bit more smoothed out, a little bit more identifiable, like classic late 70s, early 80s kind of R&B pop. And because of that, I think really there's some comparisons to Prince on this album. I think that would be fair, especially because of that accessible like crossover R&B pop style she has going on with this album, but also just her kind of general multi-instrumental prowess and her vocal capacity. In the end, that makes this album, I think, overall more consistent and more coherent than Jamie was. But because of that, there's also less risks, I think, that were taken. This one probably has less songs, would find its way into a playlist, but it's definitely one that I would play from beginning to end. And if you know where to look, those moments of risk-taking are there on this album. They're just not kind of blown up to the larger proportion that you saw in the previous album. Okay, next up I got Talk Talk, Spirit of Eden. Now, it was 2019 when I first discovered Talk Talk's final album, Laughingstock, and that kind of bleak experimentation on that ended up on that album landed in my top 20 of that year. But that album actually is considered a follow-up to this one, and this one sort of shows the beginning of the arc of experimentation that Mark Hollis would be taking as he, found its sort of boundaries with that final album. Like its follow-up, Spirit of Eden was recorded mostly in the dark. And, Mark Hollis would bring in musicians and give them sort of like these xenochrotic experiences. If you know what I'm talking about with Frank Zappa, you'd have these two unrelated recordings and layer them together and like these interactions would come out of him. I think that Mark Hollis kind of took an approach that wasn't unlike that, where you'd have a very loose kind of a guide track, and musicians would come in and play on top of it. But the musicians wouldn't hear previously recorded tracks. Instead, he would hundreds and hundreds of takes and then piece them together in these sort of soundscapes that were arranged around the songs, but that would kind of have these explosive moments and then just go back out into almost nothing, like a whisper. And like its successor, Spirit of Eden is like haunting and beautiful and shot through with experimentation. It really shows a spot I don't know that many other projects have taken on quite the same way, where it's this interesting mix between like free jazz and avant-garde minimalism and songwriting, new romantic post-pop songwriting. A lot of people kind of call these albums the beginning of post-rock. Next up I got Hans Zimmer's Dune 2 soundtrack. Now I'll tell you that Hans Zimmer's soundtrack for the first Dune movie was masterful. And it certainly deserved all the attention that it got in 2021. And it's one of those soundtracks that I think didn't quite get the traction with me that I wanted, that I hoped that it would, just because it didn't stand alone away from the movie quite as well. I see it now in retrospect as Hans Zimmer sort of defining the rules that he was going to be using for the Dune soundtrack. And Hans Zimmer's really, pretty meticulous about this. He's really about the materiality of music. I mean, if you look at the Man of Steel soundtrack, he went to that soundtrack trying to say, okay, steel, metal, drum. He came at it with like a very tactile idea about what he wanted that soundtrack to sound like. And I think the same thing happened here with the Dune soundtrack. Matter of fact, with Dune 2, if you listen to it, I was first kind of charmed by the sensation that there's sort of tape hiss on it at the beginning. And I realized, well, it's Hans Zimmer. If there's no like artifacts like that he would leave on there if he didn't mean for it to be there. It's not tape hiss, it's sand. And all of the sounds of the Dune 1 soundtrack was really just an experimentation, I think, of how to get the sound of sand just right. What I think Dune 2 does so well to sort of expand on this is he's now using those sounds and those rules that he's laid out so well in the first recording and is more apt to make them into identifiable melodies and harmonies. Hans Zimmer tends to hide his themes very often within the sounds that he uses. But on this one, because he's got a little bit better sense about what kind of sounds he wants to use as the Dune universe, now he's a little more apt to make recognizable pieces out of them. And I think it makes this particular iteration of the Dune sound world a lot more listenable overall as a standalone experience. And because of that, even though it's got almost an hour and a half runtime, it goes much faster, I believe, than the Dune 1 soundtrack, which just kind of it felt like it went on for a very long time because it didn't have as much momentum. And I think this one does. So as much as I love the Dune 1 soundtrack, I think Dune 2 is an improvement on it. And finally, I got up Hermeto, Pascoal y Grupo, Planeterio de Gavea. Hermeto Pascoal is probably one of the more overlooked kind of jazz innovators from the end of the 20th century, even though he's quite critically lauded, especially by people as picky as like Miles Davis and Frank Zappa. Both thought that, he's one of the great voices of modern jazz. But his background as far as jazz goes is very unique. He's from Brazil, born in Brazil, and was born to parents who worked the plantations in Brazil. But he was born with albinism and also attendant, very often people who have albinism have sight impairments. So he had these two things. And so growing up as a child, when his parents were out in the field working in plantation, he was unable to tolerate the sun. So he spent a lot of his childhood under trees in the shade and just kind of, playing with nature. And because of his sight impairment, this playing with nature became a very sonic experience for him. So he developed a very unique perspective on music and nature, and that eventually evolved into a very playful, philosophically inspired version of Latin jazz. Now, this recording captures him in 1981 at a planetarium, an outdoor planetarium. And the thing that's curious about Hermeto Pascoal is that because of the way that he perceives music, he will pick up almost anything and solo on it. His major instruments are saxophone and baritone horn and piano, but he'll pick up just a conch shell and play a solo on it. You have to be prepared for that when you listen to this recording because sometimes you have some very non-traditional, offbeat things that he does as a soloist, and the people in his group are doing as soloists because they've all been indoctrinated into his philosophy that keeps things moving and rolling along. And I wish that there was some sort of video footage of this recording, because I think that if you could see what he was doing, he picks up a mouthpiece for a baritone and plays a solo on it that's a pretty compelling, fun jazz solo, that you get to see all those interactions. This video, of course, doesn't exist. There's not video footage of it, but I think it would be really, as great as this recording is, it would be really enhanced by being able to see what it is that he's doing. But in any case, this is still a great document of Hermeto Pascoal and what he was able to do live. And it really captures, I think, the playful nature of his unique take on Latin fusion jazz. And that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe, share it out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I put representative tracks up from all these albums. You should go check that out. And if you want to get in on putting these albums in the bracket and voting on them for the viewer's choice top 20 at the end of the year, please sign up for my Patreon down below. Until you see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.